we see back in the Middle Ages with the Inquisition and the Crusades, etc. So the sort of civil government is given only to civil government. That's all it belongs to. He doesn't give it to anybody else. Same way with the church. We're told in Ephesians 4, the church is to raise up saints and train them for work of ministry. It's not parents who are supposed to train the saints for work of ministry. It's not the government who trains saints for the work of ministry. That's something that goes strictly to that area. So when you look at the Bible, you have these three institutions and God says, okay, here's what you guys do, here's what you guys do, here's what you guys do. So there are distinct areas that they're supposed to do, but because man's involved in it, you can't have them completely isolated, completely separated. If I'm involved in civil government, I'm going to be involved in my family, I'm going to be involved in my church, you really can't isolate them all and say, wait a minute, I've got to put on a different hat and move over here. I'm going to flow between the three. And so because I do that, you have to understand that they're not completely isolated, even though they're separate spheres, and there's ways that they can cooperate together. For example, if you take the area of family, and I'm involved in family, and if I loop that with civil government, there's areas that government's supposed to do, areas that family's supposed to do, but there's areas where they can cooperate. Now, what is it that family and government can cooperate to? What would help both of them if they both worked in this area? One answer is strong families. If government works to build strong families and family works to build strong families, they both benefit from that without violating their jurisdictional separation. Now, this is not saying that governments create strong families, because they don't, but they can create an environment that helps families be strong, which is going to help government as a benefit. So it's not government's responsibility to create strong families. It's their responsibility not to damage what the family is supposed to do with its own family, and that means creating an atmosphere for good policies. If you look at the area of family and church, what benefits both of them? Well, quite frankly, having strong Christians benefits both. If the family works on having strong Christians, that helps the church, and if the church works on having strong Christians, that helps the family, and neither one has violated the jurisdiction of the other. In the same way, if you take church and government, now we often hear this as church and state, I thought they're supposed to be separate. Well, they are. They are separate institutions, but there are things they can do to cooperate. What would benefit both of them? What could you get church and government both working on that would help both of them? And the answer is building strong citizens. Now, this is why we teach civics and government and math and science and so many other things. You want educated citizens, you want strong citizens, you want citizens who know how the process works. And interestingly, when you look at strong citizens, one of the best ways to have strong citizens was actually given by the Founding Fathers years ago, and there's so many founders we could choose from, but I'm going to choose Daniel Webster as the example. This is what Daniel Webster said, great defender of the Constitution. He said, whatever makes men good Christians makes them good citizens, and that's true. It's not the good Christians that the police have to arrest for drive-by shootings or violence or all sorts of abuse. And good Christians make good citizens, but those two things do go together. And that's something where that actually church and state can cooperate, is in building strong citizens. And again, it's government that provides the atmosphere for that to occur. Government doesn't do it, they just provide the atmosphere. So you have all of these institutions, and they do have cooperative functions. They do have things they can do together. Now, going back to Genesis as a seed plot, let's take another step. All right, we've seen kind of how that there's institutions and God created all of them, and He gave jurisdictions to all of them. He gave responsibilities to all of them. They can cooperate, which means we as individual citizens can and should be involved in that. But let's go back to the beginning at the creation. When you look at the creation, it's told in two places. You have the creation told in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. And as you see all the creation, how it develops, He separates the waters above from the waters below, and He separates the firmament. He puts a greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He creates the oceans and all that are in it, and then the land and the plants and the animals. And He goes through all of it. We finally get to man. And a good question to ask is, why did God create man? Because we know that God created man. He tells us that. The question is, why did He create man? And this is a good time to say, okay, what does the Bible say about that? And an answer we've heard since 1646, this is when the Scottish Shorter Catechism came out, which really affected theology in the Protestant church realm. The chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And that's a really good purpose. I mean, that's sound. Big question to ask is, okay, what does the Bible say? Can you show me a Bible verse that says that is why God created man? Well, that is something man should be doing, no question. But when you look, that's not what the book of Genesis tells us about why God created man. When you look in Genesis to see why, you go back to those two chapters. And when you look at the two chapters, after God's gone through everything in the 6 days and He's got it all created, We're told in Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and 15, starting first with verse 5, it said, God looked at all He had created, and it was very good. And then He saw that He had no one to tend His garden. So He made man. It's interesting. Man's purpose was to take care of God's stuff. God had created all this stuff. He didn't have anybody to take care of it for Him. And so we're told in Genesis verse 15 that once God put man in the garden, man tended the garden. What we see in Genesis is very similar to what Jesus told us in Luke 19:13 about tending the garden. Because you remember there in Luke 19:13, Jesus says, you need to do business. You need to be about doing things till I get back. So taking care of the garden, tending the business, Old Testament, New Testament, we get it. And it's interesting that when you look today, this is kind of in what's described as a seven mountains kind of thing, because what is the Lord's? What is His garden? Well, we're told in the Scriptures, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, everything in it. Today we say, well, that includes entertainment and education and media and religion and family and government and business. We're supposed to be taking care of His stuff in all of these areas. Now, say we've gotten out of so many of them. I mean, even entertainment. Did you know that until 1968, Hollywood couldn't come out with a movie unless church leaders signed off on it. And the church said, oh, we shouldn't be doing that secular stuff. Let's get out of entertainment. How has that worked out over the years? I mean, we recently came across an archive of 17 letters back when they did the Academy Award-winning movie Gone with the Wind. 17 letters going back and forth over whether they should use the one word damn in the movie. Rhett Butler, as he leaves, frankly, my dear, I don't give a... They had a massive outcry. You can't use a curse word in a movie. Oh my goodness, look how far we've come. But see, we used to be involved in all these, education, all of these areas, and so we've gotten out of them. And how's that working out for us? We've gotten out of government. That's one of the parts of His garden we're supposed to be taking care of. So there is a biblical mandate, a biblical responsibility to do this. So civil government is one of those areas we're to operate in. And one of the easiest ways to do that is at least by voting. Now, voting is very significant, but it's something that a lot of people don't tend the garden through voting. As a matter of fact, as you look at something like Los Angeles, and you take Los Angeles, one of the largest cities in the nation, and the mayor of Los Angeles announced that he had been elected with 2.9% of the adult vote in the city. Oh my goodness, 2.9%? There's a lot more people that could have taken care of the garden of Los Angeles, and you consider the policies they have and so much that's out there. Even in Texas, the city of Houston, the mayor of Houston the population of Houston is such that if you're the mayor of Houston, there are 26 states, individual states in the United States, who have less population than the population of Houston. So being the mayor of Houston is like being a governor in 26 states, and the mayor of Houston's elected with 6% of adults voting. So one of the easy things we can do to tend the garden in the area of government is to be involved in elections. And that's local elections and county elections and state elections and federal elections. But there's more to it than that. There's more that we can learn about the process, and there's more that we can do in the process. And this is where a knowledge of constitutional process is important, a knowledge of American history is important. The more educated and informed you are, the more effective you are, and the more you can make a difference in the system. So let's go to the American founding. When you look at the American founding, and you look at what these guys did in creating their Constitution, and by the way, there's 5,600 years of recorded human history. And when you look at that, a question to ask is, okay, they created a government, but what's the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? And history tells us 17 years. The Constitution we got from these guys is now over 200 years old. It is the longest ongoing Constitution in the history of the world. Every year on Constitution Day, we set another world's record. We've set so many world's records on stability, we don't even think about it anymore. It's natural, normal to us. But the question is, okay, everybody had access to the same set of ideas they had in their day because they were political writers. You have millions of books, you have thousands of years of history, you have a lot of political writers. Where did they get the ideas that created our government to be so different? And that question was asked by political science professors at the University of Houston who said, why don't we go back and collect writings from the founding era and see who they quoted? Because if we can find out who they quoted, we'll know who's important to them. So they did that. The results were released in this study called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. They went back and found those 15,000 writings they thought were representative. And as they went through them, they found 3,154 direct quotes out of those writings. They said, now, let's find out where that quote originated. And so it took them 10 years, but they tracked every single quote back to its original source. And at the end of 10 years, they released the report and they said, what we now know is the number one most cited individual in the American founding was a French philosopher by the name of Baron Charles Montesquieu. In 1750, he wrote a 2-volume set called The Spirit of Laws that was used heavily by the Founding Fathers. They quoted from him frequently. The number 2 most cited individual in the American founding era was Justice William Blackstone, English judge who wrote the commentaries on the Constitution, 4-volume set. It's a great book. They cited it regularly. Thomas Jefferson said that American attorneys read Blackstone's like Muslims read the Quran. So that was a big book to them. The number 3 most cited individual was John Locke. In 1690, he did a book called The Two Treatises of Civil Government. In those 2 treatises, by the way, it's a little book, less than an inch thick, 400 pages long. He references the Bible more than 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. So if you think the Bible doesn't say much about government or doesn't refer to it, read that book from 1690. That's got a lot in it. So these are the 3 most cited individuals, but what surprised them was the number 1 most cited source out of all sources was the Bible. 34% of all the quotes they looked at from the founding era came out of the Bible. That goes to the concept of biblical citizenship. They used the Bible to help create a form of government that's now the most stable government in the world, and it was built on these concepts and ideas from the Bible. So there is grounds for us knowing and being involved biblically. Now, when you look at the document that they did, this document, the Declaration of Independence, starts out with 161 words that gives forth 6 principles of government. After those 6 principles of government, they then give you 27 grievances showing how those principles have been violated. And then at the end, they have a resolve. They say that we mutually pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, and they were doing this with a reliance on divine providence. So that's the closing part. But let's go back to the 161 words. 4 of those 6 principles of government are pretty simple. They start by saying there is a divine creator. Then they say, the divine creator has given us a fixed moral law. Then they say he gives us inalienable rights, or what we would call natural rights sometimes, but inalienable rights. And the purpose of government is to protect the rights that God has given us. Now, if you take this, let me just take the second one for a minute, that he's established a fixed moral law. In the Declaration, they called it the laws of nature, nature's God. Let me just take one example of how that this dual phrase, in other words, there's the laws of nature, what we see in what God created, and there's the laws of nature's God, which is written down in the Scriptures. Let me just take the area of self-defense for just a minute. If you take the area of self-defense, it's interesting to see how the Founding Fathers framed this as an inalienable right that came from God that reflected the laws of nature, nature's God. If you take John Adams said, "Resistance to sudden violence for the preservation not only of my person, my limbs, and my life, but of my property is an indisputable right of nature." Oh, there's nature. There's the laws of nature. He said, "which I never surrender to the public by the compact of society, and which perhaps I could not surrender if I would." This is a God-given right. I can't give it up. He said, "The maxims of the law and the precepts of Christianity are precisely coincident in relation to this subject." Now, he says the law and Christianity. So that's the laws of nature and the laws of the God who created nature, which we find in the Bible. So he finds self-defense being part of both. And yeah, if we look in the Bible, we can point to Exodus 22:2 as a verse on self-defense. We can point to 2 passages in the book of Nehemiah. We can point to passages in the Gospel of Luke. So there's lots there on self-defense. Now, James Wilson, who is a founding father who signed the Declaration and the Constitution and was on the original Supreme Court and started the first law school in America and actually wrote the first law books, his lectures, he said the same thing. Notice how he said it. He says, "The great natural law of self-preservation cannot be repealed or superseded or suspended by any human institution. This came from God, and nobody can take it away from us because it came from God." He says, "The right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves shall not be questioned." You can't even get close to challenging that because that's a God-given right. He says, "Every man's house is deemed by the law to be his castle, and the law invests him with the power and places on him the duty of the commanding officer of his house." All right, now grab this. He said, your house is your castle, and if it's your castle, you're the commanding officer of your house. You have a duty to defend your castle, and that's why he said, every man's house is his castle, and if anyone be robbed in it, it shall be esteemed his own default and negligence. In other words, my house is my castle. If I get robbed in my castle, it's not the police's fault for not being there. It's my fault for not defending it. God put it in my hands. So this is the phrase that we sometimes hear called the castle doctrine. I have no duty to retreat in my home. That's a God-given right, comes out of the Scriptures, comes out of the law of nature. You find it in nature. If you attack the home of any creature in nature, they're going to defend that home. They're going to defend their young and their property and their life. That's a law of nature, and it's a law of nature's God. But the castle doctrine we hear associated with this, we need to go back and understand where that castle doctrine came from. It is a biblical concept, but it's not limited just to the Second Amendment. I want to take you back to a guy named James Otis. James Otis was a founding father to the founding fathers. A number of the big name founding fathers, John Adams and Sam Adams and John Hancock, they were mentored by this man right here. He was a great attorney. He was in the years leading up to the American Revolution. And one of the most notable things he did was an argument in front of the British courts in 1761 here in America. 1761 here in America, it dealt with what were called writs of assistance. Now, we don't really know what that is today because we don't study it much. This is super, super important because a writ of assistance was very much like a search warrant, except it was blank. There was nothing filled in on it. So what happens is, if I'm a British official and I say, I want a writ of assistance, I'm going to your house, I walk into your house with a blank search warrant. And I start going through all the closets and cupboards, and I pull out all the drawers, and I look under all the mattresses, and I keep looking till I find something that I think is illegal. And once I find it, then I will fill out that search warrant and say, this is what I was looking for. I was looking for whatever you had over here in the third drawer down in the chest of drawers. And then I fill it out and I go give it to a judge and said, I found something illegal in his home. And the judge says, well, go arrest him. He had something illegal. That writ of assistance allowed anybody to come into your home at any point in time and look for anything that they might consider to be illegal, whether they actually knew something was there or not. So what happened was he argued against this in the courts. This is what he told the judges. He said, I will to my dying day oppose with all the powers and faculties God has given me all such instruments as slavery and villainy as the writ of assistance is. To him, there was nothing more low than those writs of assistance. So he's arguing against it to the British courts, and he's a British attorney. He said, it is the worst instrument of arbitrary power and is destructive of liberty and the fundamental principles of law. One of the most essential rights is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle. These writs totally annihilate these rights. Now, notice this phrase, a man's house is his castle. This is where it gets used in American history. This is where it pops up. A lot of the other founding fathers quoted it later, but it goes back to this argument right here. A man's house is his castle. He said, it's a power that places the liberty of every man in the hands of every petty officer. In other words, any government bureaucrat can now come in and take my liberty away. My house is no longer my castle. Who may reign secure in his petty tyranny and spread terror and desolation around him. Both reason and the Constitution are against such writs. Now, I mentioned that he had a huge impact on a number of founding fathers, and one was a young John Adams who saw all the arguments that went with this, because this was British policy at the time. It was being done by the British, but John Adams heard this. A man's house is his castle. And he thought about that for the next 15 years leading up to the American Revolution. And as we got close to the Revolution, this is what John Adams recalled looking back. He said that regarding that 1761 case, he said American independence was then and there born. Where? In that courtroom when he argued that a man's house is his castle. Every man in the crowded audience went away, as I did, ready to take arms against writs of assistance. This kind of tyranny we won't tolerate. There and then was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there where the child independence was born. In 15 years, namely in 1776, he grew up to manhood and declared himself free. So he's saying everything we did in American independence movement goes back to the writs of assistance in 1761, which was based on the doctrine that every man's home is his castle. Now, let's take that concept for a bit, that a man's home is his castle. And it's interesting that when you look at several amendments in the Constitution, remember, amendments in the Constitution are given to protect God-given rights. This is the Constitution saying, government, you can't touch these rights. They come from God to us. And so when you look at the Second Amendment, we talked about that. That's the castle doctrine. You have the right to defend your home and your property. You have your right to defend life. We don't have to back away from that. That's a God-given right that God gives us in the laws of nature, and nature's God. So that's a man's house is a castle. But let's go to the Third Amendment for a minute. because the Third Amendment seems a little unusual. It deals with the quartering of British troops in private homes. When the British were over here, we'd never needed the British military before. We did all of our own fighting. And suddenly we find ourselves in the American Revolution with 25,000 soldiers at a time coming to America. They don't have a place to stay because there's not British forts here. So they start putting British soldiers in the homes of private citizens. And they say, ma'am, we're here in Boston. You take 4 of these soldiers. Mister, you take these 8. Ma'am, you take these 7. And suddenly we're quartering troops in our homes. Now, this is a real problem from the standpoint of man's home as his castle, which is why we have the Third Amendment of the Constitution that says you can't quarter military troops in private homes. But it's not just military troops. Remember the concept that's underlying all this. What's underlying this is a man's home is his castle. We don't let government come into our castle and start doing what they want. And that doesn't matter whether it's with defense or with our own property, stepping into our homes, making it like the government's home. You'll find it in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 24, there is this passage, very interesting. This goes back to the castle doctrine. It says, when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, so I'm making a loan to my neighbor, I'm going to get collateral from him, do not go into that man's house to get what was offered to you as a pledge. In other words, don't go collecting the collateral by going into his house. Stay outside his house and let the neighbor to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. I don't even get to go into my neighbor's house to pick up collateral that he's putting down on a loan. I stay outside his house and he brings it to me. Why is that? Because a man's house is his castle. This is a biblical teaching. That's why over the castle, the parents are in charge of the children. Not the government's in charge of children, the parents are, because it's our castle. So this is part of the Third Amendment. Even if you look at the Fourth Amendment, Fourth Amendment, very interesting. Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is all about writs of assistance. Now notice what it says here. If you read that, if I just read that and don't think about the modern era, if I just read it for what it says, I'm going to say, you know what? IRS audits and bureaucratic agency searches of my receipts or papers, you can't do that. IRS can't demand to audit me. Here's why. Because what does it say? It says you cannot search my papers. That would be my check stubs. That would be my business receipts. You can't search my papers unless you have a warrant issued by a judge on probable cause. Somebody has to swear to a judge that, yep, I saw him and he's got all sorts of corrupt stuff in his books. Somebody has to swear to a judge, probable cause. Then they have to do it on oath or affirmation. They're swearing under the law of perjury. If they're telling a lie, then they're in trouble. And it has to particularly describe the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. In other words, if the IRS wants to do an audit on me, they have to say, we have a warrant from a judge. These are the witnesses that saw you do illegal things with your books, and we want to see check stub number 478 through 941. That's what they got to do. They can't just come in and search my papers, because my house is my castle. That's a biblical doctrine, and that's why when you look at the Bill of Rights and the scope and reach of government, because you remember back at the beginning, God gives certain jurisdictions to each form of government. There's only certain things they can do. But you know what? If we as Christians don't understand that, we'll let those lines get all melted, and government will get into doing stuff the family should do or that the church should do. Everything gets mixed up. So biblical citizenship starts with understanding biblical lines of jurisdiction and even our own history. So a man's house is his castle. That's where we get the due process and the right to privacy we have in the Constitution. All the stuff is in there, and it comes out of the castle doctrine, which is a biblical doctrine. It's part of the laws of nature, nature's God, which is what the Declaration guarantees to each of us. So there is indeed a biblical responsibility and even a biblical mandate for us to be active and informed and aware citizens in all that goes on around us with civil government.
It is astounding to me how many people in America have been indoctrinated into a condition of complete ignorance, completely unaware of the extent to which the Bible and ancient Jewish wisdom shaped the founders. You know, as David Barton has pointed out so brilliantly, it's not an accident that the crests of these old schools like Yale and Harvard contain Hebrew words, because to these people who came here and set things up, the people we think of as the founders, Hebrew was something they knew. The second governor of the Plymouth colony was Sir William Bradford. The first 19 pages of his manuscript, his history book, the history of the Plymouth plantation, is actually in his own handwriting in Hebrew. So it's really rather remarkable. But yes, I don't doubt for a moment that if any of the founders came back to life, they would be much more comfortable sitting down over lunch with you and me than they would sitting down over lunch at any government university campus in the country.
You know, if you really contrast how citizens in other countries that don't have the freedom that we have live out their religion, you begin to realize how much we have and we take for granted. For example, Harry Mahet, who is one of our legal counsel at Liberty Counsel, our chief litigation counsel, he was raised in communist Romania. And in communist Romania, his dad was arrested, other pastors were arrested for bringing Bibles into then communist Romania. He has a situation once where the secret police came in with the German Shepherd sniffing dogs. They were trying to find contraband. The contraband were Bibles that the missionaries smuggled in. Fortunately, they never found them. In those kinds of countries, when you see the lack of religious freedom, the lack of freedom of expression, and then you see it here, we take it for granted. And so we have to realize how precious the freedom is that we have. And it is the ability, the freedom, frankly, the duty, the opportunity to be able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with our friends, with our families, in our churches, in our homes, and in the public square. And so that's really how you exercise it. That's how you preserve your freedom, is you exercise your freedom.
Yeah, a few years ago, David Barton and I had written a book called U-Turn, and one of the things that we did was we looked at the values of people in colonial days and then moved through history and compared it with the values that people have today. Values are just one indication of the worldview that people possess, because your values come out of that worldview. And one of the things that we discovered is that back in the late 1700s to early 1800s, the values of Americans were very distinct. But when we compared that distinct list of primary values, and there were about 9 of them, to the primary values that people hold today, there isn't one value that overlaps from colonial America to today. And that's just one of a number of indications we have that our worldview has radically shifted. What we believed back during the founding years of the country and the years and decades immediately after that bears no resemblance to the values and the morals and the mores, the traditions, the lifestyles that people choose today. And it all comes back to this issue of worldview.
I think a lot of people today want to talk about authenticity and us being relatable, and yet we're missing it. Our nation was founded upon the pulpits that were ablaze. Alexa de Tocqueville talked about that, where pastors spoke to the issues of the day, and that caught the attention of the people. Instead of us trying to make our ministry relevant today, all we need to do is rely upon the Word of God and speak the Word of God into the issues of life. That makes us relevant. The Holy Spirit, the Bible is relevant. And I think we've lost that in the last 60 to 80 years in America. If we get back to doing that, I think we'll see our nation recover both in our cultural awareness and certainly our biblical relatability, where Christians are speaking into the culture truth. People resonate to truth if they're hungry for it. They need to see it.
Rick Green coming to you live from the Lone Star State of Texas. I'm really excited today because our family just got back from one of the coolest celebrations in the country. Paul Revere's ride, the battles of Lexington and Concord on the anniversary of the shot heard around the world. And that begs the question, who fired that first shot?
There's a lot of mystery around the question of who shot first.
I have a feeling that Dad has some evidence.
Somebody's got to know.
It's an opportunity to relive that special day.
Black powder, fire, explosions.
It feels like we have stepped back in time.
2 of the greatest men our nation has ever known, right here.
Watching a reenactment is really cool, but being a part of it is even that much cooler.
That's why Paul Revere was coming to this house. The British had a price on their head.
All the while, you can hear the drums of the British. A fight is coming. We still had one looming unanswered question. Who fired the first shot?
All right, we are in the Wall Builders Collection, this amazing place of Founding Fathers documents and American history. Tim Barton, David Barton, thanks for having us in, man. This place is incredible.
Great to have you here, and it's really cool because this is history that really belongs to all of us, whether we know it or not. I mean, this is our heritage, our history. There's so much good stuff in here to be uncovered and revealed.
Well, you said good stuff, but then there's been a major attack on American history. So is our history good or bad or ugly or all of the above? We've really got to defend the American story. If we're going to talk about defending freedom, we're going to talk about we want to revive freedom. Well, is it even worth reviving? Is the American story actually good or bad? Tim, you've been digging into
Okay, we're taking a 10-minute break. Pause the video here now. Okay, we're going to start live feed again.
To this over the last year or so, specifically to respond
Yeah.
to this accusation that America is just evil at its core and not even worth preserving. So take us down that road of history.
Yeah, so it's a crazy assumption, crazy statements, and obviously we know from Scripture that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Therefore, we know America's not perfect, and nobody that's ever lived in America has been perfect. With that being said, the fact that now most students can say more bad things about America than good things about America is a reflection that we've done a very bad job. And this is where you can know that there's been a lot of bad history being taught. One of the places where a lot of this has been learned was the 1619 Project, and this was done by Nicole Hannah-Jones. At least she was the chief editor of this. And the New York Times wanted people to learn about how bad America was. And actually the premise was that America was not founded in 1776, as the Declaration of Independence was done, and we separated from Great Britain, and America actually became her own nation. No, that's not when America was founded. America was founded, the argument is, in 1619, when the first shipload of slaves arrived in America in Jamestown. Now, with that being said, if you look at the original statement, the mission statement, the statement of purpose from the 1619 Project, here's the reason they said they existed. The 1619 Project is a major initiative from the New York Times observing the anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. It aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. So the idea that we want to retell the American story and make sure that we highlight slavery and 1619 as the origins of the story, well, throughout the New York Times Project, throughout the New York Times articles in 1619, actually on their website, you can go and see these articles. There's an article that, and this is the title of the article, "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true." Now, it absolutely is accurate that Black Americans have fought throughout American history as patriots, promoting American ideals and visions. But the notion that our founding ideals were false, well, the founding ideals were from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Those were the founding ideals, and actually the notion that there is a God and He gave rights to man and government's main job is to protect our God-given rights, those ideals are true now and they were true then. But this notion that Black Americans are the ones that fought to make them true, well, that would discount all of the abolitionists who were not Black. That would discount all of the heroes throughout American history, not only that weren't Black, many who weren't even white, men and women, but we don't know those stories, but this is the accusation. Another article says America holds an undemocratic assumption from its founding that some people deserve more power than others. Now, America's founding, I would argue, was 1776, when America actually separated from Great Britain to become a nation. The premise of separating from the king was the king thought he had all the power and the people didn't have power and there wasn't equality. And so the Americans said, we are against the notion that some people should have more power than others. This is the exact opposite of how we were founded. Another article says slavery gave America a fear of Black people and a taste for violent punishment. Both still define our prison system. So the notion that we are scared of Black people in America, if you're not Black, you're scared of Black people, and that violent punishment defines our prison system, I'm not sure of the violent punishment that's taking place in our prison system today. If it is, I would probably be opposed to it. But this is the notion that kids are learning. These are the articles that are being written. This is being taught in schools today. Here's another article. The sugar that saturates the American diet has a barbaric history as the white gold that fueled slavery. The purpose of the article is to identify that candy and candy bars was rooted in slavery and white supremacy. So if you eat candy bars, you might be a white supremacist. This is crazy, but these are the arguments being made today. Another article. Most Americans still don't know the full story of slavery. This is the history you didn't learn in school. I will agree. Most Americans have no idea the full story of slavery, but this is not something that is actually being identified in the 1619 Project. It's going the wrong direction. And even advocates of the 1619 Project, people like Democrat Senator Tim Kaine, he said that America actually created slavery. We didn't inherit it from anybody. If you think America created slavery, you had the worst world history teacher in the history of school, because obviously there was slavery before America was a nation. Study the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, and if you're familiar with the Bible, I'm a Christian, I believe in the Bible, I believe it is true. If you go to the book of Genesis, Joseph was the one who had dreams, and his father made them this coat of many colors. Joseph's brothers sold him into something. Oh yeah, slavery. Moses delivered the Israelites from slavery. America didn't create slavery, and yet this is what kids are learning today. This is why we have an entire generation that thinks America has done more bad than we've done good, because we don't know basic history. Well, you now even see in the NBA, here's the article. In the NBA, the very term owner has come under fire as players, most of whom are black, assert self-determination. There's a group of players in the NBA who said the term owner offends them because it implies they are owned, and that goes back to their roots of their ancestors being slaves. If you are a business owner, the assumption is not that you own your employees, rather that you own the business and you hire people to work for you. But we now live in a culture that is so woke that we can't even use the term of a business owner without it presumably offending somebody in the midst of all of this. The New York Times was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for their great work in the 1619 Project. And when this happened, there was a lot of promotion from the New York Times saying, we want to make this a curriculum for all kinds of teachers. And actually right now, this is being used in all 50 states in different schools in those states. And kids are learning these very lessons today. Well, as this all unfolded, there was also a group of professors who came out and said, this is totally inaccurate. And so professors came out pointing out the historical inaccuracies of what was being said. Now, professors on the left and right side of the political spectrum who just know basic history pointed out how many fallacies were in these articles and inaccurate statements were being made, and kids were learning things that simply weren't true. With that being said, you would think maybe the New York Times, the 1619 Project, would have some corrections and would change some of these articles. If you go to their website, there's only one correction listed on their website, and it says an earlier version of the introduction to this project referred incorrectly to Virginia in the year 1619 as a British colony. At the time, it was an English colony. So the only correction they make is to clarify that actually it wasn't a British colony, an English colony. Well, there's a lot of other inaccuracies being said, and here's the problem with this. Is there is a lot of important history that's been lost, including a lot of black history, a lot of black heroes that have been lost, and even a lot of terrible things that happened in American history. And Americans need to learn the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The problem is today what's being said not only is misrepresenting what is true, many things are just flat out lies and dishonest in the way they're being presented. And what's also lost is the fact that in America, when we look back to Jamestown and say, well, the first group of slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619, Jamestown was not the only major settlement in America. In fact, America largely could be referenced back to Charles Dickens' classic novel, A Tale of Two Cities, because America was largely defined by two major early cities or early colonies, and it was Jamestown, and the second major colony was Plymouth. Both of these colonies had a major impact in American history, and both had an incredible legacy they left, but both were very different legacies. If you look at Jamestown, we probably are semi-familiar with some of the people from Jamestown, which was founded in 1607, and people like Captain John Smith, or the name Pocahontas, who's one of the great heroes as we've studied history. Well, those are names we would know from Jamestown, and certainly there were some great people in Jamestown. But Jamestown definitely had some major problems as well. Jamestown went through a period known as a starving time where they actually turned to cannibalism. They had some major issues in Jamestown. They didn't always have great relations with the Native Americans and the Indians. And so there no doubt was issues with Jamestown. But that was just one of the early primary colonies. The other colony was Plymouth. Plymouth was founded in 1620, and if you look at some of the story of Plymouth, we know some major names like Governor William Bradford, but also there's major players to the story, people like Somerset, who was an Indian that the Pilgrims met who actually spoke some English, and he told them that there was another Indian who spoke even better English than he did, and he wanted to introduce them to Squanto, and so he left and came back with Squanto, and they actually met the chief of the tribe, Chief Massasoit. In the midst of all of this, what they discovered was that the Wampanoag Indians were a very good Indian people, a very great tribe. they made a peace treaty with the Wampanoags that was the longest lasting peace treaty between any whites and any natives in American history. The treaty lasted more than 50 years. Now, this is just part of the legacy of Plymouth, that even today we don't know much of the story of Plymouth and their relation with the Indians and how good it was in so many scenarios. But let me back you up to Jamestown, because the argument is that America was really built as a slave nation. Well, Jamestown was founded in 1607, but in 1619, there was a shipload of slaves that arrived in America. Approximately 20 slaves arrived on a British ship, and the British ship had just captured these slaves off of Portuguese trade ships. When they came to Jamestown, they were sold to the people of Jamestown, but they actually were sold as indentured servants. In indentured servitude, you worked for a period of several years, and generally about 7 years. At the end of 7 years, you would receive your freedom. All of those approximately 20 slaves not only received their freedom, they became free landowners, and some of them became very wealthy landowners in Jamestown. It wasn't until 1651 that chattel slavery actually became legal in Virginia, or legal in the New World, and this is long after 1619, but again, this is Jamestown. That's one colony. There was a second colony, Plymouth. If you look at Plymouth, their history of slavery is very different. In fact, in Plymouth in 1641, they passed some early laws that actually forbid man stealing. And man stealing they defined as capturing someone off of a continent, transporting them across the ocean to a new continent to sell them into slavery. This was specifically targeting the North Atlantic or the African slave trade that was going on at the time. Now, in 1641, they did pass a law where they said that slavery was legal in two conditions. It was legal for punishment for a crime, that you could be a slave for so many years, or it was legal if you were captured in justified warfare. And some people today want to say, well, the fact that they allowed slavery in any conditions is terrible, but remember, this is the 1600s. And if it's a justified war, meaning it was a war where you were defending your property, defending your family, defending your people and nation, you didn't start the war, but you were defending. Well, if you conquered a people in the 1600s, there were only two options for a conquered people group after a war. You either killed them or you enslaved them. And this wasn't something unique for the Pilgrims. This was the way the world operated for literally thousands of years. And so this was the Pilgrims being normal. But they did say it was against the law to man steal, to kidnap somebody off a continent, to transport them to a new continent and sell them into slavery. Now that law matters. In 1646, the first shipload of slaves arrived in Plymouth from Africa. But because man stealing was a crime in Plymouth, the people of Plymouth imprisoned the ship captain and the crew, and they freed all of the slaves, and they actually charged the crew and the captain with the crime of man stealing. This is a big deal because you see the legacy of Plymouth is very different than the legacy of Jamestown, and this is what's lost today. One of the cool things that was done in the late 1800s is a map showing the legacy from Plymouth and the legacy of Jamestown, and it shows the legacy of Jamestown promoted slavery in many of the southern states, southern colonies, but the legacy of Plymouth promoted freedom and work ethic and responsibility and biblical values over the majority of the nation. Why does this matter? As the map even identifies, although Jamestown had a very significant legacy in America, the majority of America was not impacted from the legacy of Jamestown. The majority of America was impacted from the legacy of Plymouth and what it promoted throughout all of the nation. But today, we're not learning about the positive things that Plymouth promoted or brought to the New World. What we're learning about is the negative impact of Jamestown, and even some of that is overstated or misstated in what's being said. But this is where the 1619 Project gets it so wrong. One of the things the 1619 Project also says is we need to be learning in America about some of the black heroes who have contributed along the way to the American story. And I totally agree. It's just that the 1619 Project has left out a lot of very important black heroes that they should be highlighting. People like the Reverend Harry Hoosier, who was considered an evangelist in the Second Great Awakening. Now, he was a slave early on in life. He got saved and decided he wanted to share the gospel message with others. He joined up with the Reverend Francis Asbury, who was one of the leaders in the Methodist denomination at the time, and they began traveling together. Well, Reverend Harry Hoosier actually began drawing larger crowds than the more famous Francis Asbury, and even founding fathers had heard Harry Hoosier speak. People like Benjamin Rush, who knew every major founding father. Benjamin Rush said, considering that Harry Hoosier never had a formal education, he was the best speaker he ever heard. Well, Harry Hoosier, because he had grown up on really kind of a slave plantation and he was a skilled labor kind of guy, he was a blue collar worker, so he felt that he would be best reaching people who really were the outdoors people, the working with your hands kind of people. And so he began evangelizing and witnessing to people who were very rough people, and when they would get saved, they would have dramatic conversions, their lives would be totally changed, and they began to be known by the name Hoosier when they would convert to Christianity, because people would see, hey, you're different than you used to be. What's different about you? Oh, you're one of those Hoosiers now. You got saved under Harry Hoosier, and this was kind of the thought that happened. Now, a lot of these guys that were getting saved and having conversions under the work of Harry Hoosier began moving from where he was out to the Indiana territory. Now, Indiana became known as the Hoosier State. Actually, the state of Indiana, this is their mascot for even one of their universities. Well, where did they get the name Hoosier? You can go back to the Reverend Harry Hoosier from the Second Great Awakening. This is what's very interesting about this is if we're going to talk about black heroes who had a major impact on America, he's a guy certainly who should be included, and yet most people have never heard the story of Harry Hoosier. But if we go to something like the American Revolution, which is where I would argue this is when America became a nation, if you look at the American Revolution, things like in April 1775, this is when guys like Paul Revere came to notoriety because Paul Revere makes his famous midnight ride. If you're a student of history, you know, as the British are marching through the colonies, there were many people who made famous rides to warn other Americans the British were coming. One of the guys who made a very famous midnight ride, or at least one of those kind of rides, was this man down here. His name was Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was actually an elected politician, elected to multiple positions, but he was a guy who made a famous midnight ride, or a famous ride. It might not have started at midnight, but it was through the night to warn Americans that the British were coming. But he was elected to office as a young man up in the New England states, and not only was he elected to office, we own some of his documents from what he did, and he served for nearly 49 years, being elected by a primarily white community to serve in a variety of positions. And this, again, is contradictory to some of the narrative we hear today that, well, the white people really oppressed the black people and the black people didn't have freedom. And certainly there were many occasions when that did happen, but that's not the entire story. There are numerous examples of early black officials or black politicians being elected in different capacities, and Wentworth Cheswell was one of those guys making a famous ride warning Americans the British were coming. In the midst of that, let's back up to Paul Revere. When Paul Revere is making his famous midnight ride, he's riding specifically looking for John Hancock and Sam Adams. The reason was he wanted to warn them about the British coming because these were major leaders in the early Revolution period. Well, Paul Revere rode to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark, who was a friend to both of these guys, and he was a cousin to John Hancock. When Paul Revere arrives, both of those guys were there. He warned them the British were coming, and the next morning the British arrived. And this is where at Lexington Green, you had the shot heard round the world, where approximately 70 Americans took on more than 700 British throughout this skirmish. At the end, there were 18 Americans who were dead or wounded. Among those Americans were John Robbins and Prince Estabrook, a black and white man, both recorded to have been there, and both of them who attended the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark. So black and white men fighting together in the cause of freedom, in the cause of the revolution. And this is something that Prince Estabrook used to be a very well-known person from the Battle of Lexington. Even today, if you go visit Lexington, there is a statue, a little monument rather, honoring Prince Estabrook there. Well, this is as the revolution kicks off. As the revolution continues, you have major battles, like in June 1775, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. And this is a painting done depicting the Battle of Bunker Hill. And over here on the right, there is a black patriot. This is Peter Salem. He's standing behind a white guy, Thomas Grosvenor. And Peter Salem actually was the hero of the battle. Over the decades following the Battle of Bunker Hill, there were many paintings, many different depictions of Peter Salem that were done, highlighting the fact that he was the hero that happened. And the reason he was the hero is because, as you see in this picture, the British officer who was leading the charge, and if you remember the story of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, the British charged and were repelled the first time. They charged the second time, and the Americans the second time repelled them, and the British were taking heavy casualties. The third time they charged, the Americans ran out of ammunition. So now the British were going to be able to come and take them and conquer them and maybe kill them all. Well, the officer leading the charge was Major Pitcairn. And as he was leading the charge, Peter Salem had a shot left. He shot the officer, British officer leading the charge. It allowed the Americans time to escape. After they escaped, many of the American officers who were there said, that man should be promoted for his bravery on the battlefield, his courage. He saved all our lives. He received over a dozen commendations for his bravery on the battlefield, and he wasn't the only man who was honored on the battlefield that day. Salempur was also there and was also recognized as being a great warrior on the battlefield. And this is still early in the Revolution as the Revolution continues. If you go to December 1776, when George Washington crosses the Delaware, the Battle of Trenton's about to unfold, the famous painting done of Washington crossing the Delaware, in the front of the boat, Prince Whipple, this black man, was depicted being with Washington, which historically we know he was with Washington when Washington crosses the Delaware, and we know he wasn't the only black patriot there because there's record that Oliver Cromwell, a black patriot, was there also. Well, this is now still 1776. We're early on in the Revolution as you continue on. This is just one of many, many examples. Again, there are so many examples we can point to. Let me give you my last example, relatively speaking, but it's probably my favorite example. In 1781, this is where the Revolution is coming to a close, although the Americans don't really know that yet. Marquis de Lafayette was a French major general, and when he came to America as a 19-year-old young man, he teamed up with George Washington, and he's helping the Americans fight for freedom. Washington assigned Marquis de Lafayette to track the movement of many of the British officers because we were trying to capture officers and really know where their troops were going. And so for Lafayette to do this, he set up his own spy ring. And one of the things he did in his spy ring was he would take many of the black patriots and he would tell them, pretend to be escaped slaves, go seek refuge in the British camp, and then just try to gather whatever intelligence you can, come back and let me know. I'll tell Washington. Well, one of the guys who joined him in 1781 was James Armistead. James Armistead was from Richmond, Virginia, and when Richmond was conquered, James decided he wants to sign up and he wants to help fight for American independence. At the time, he was a slave. But in Virginia, the law said that if you fought for a year, you could have your freedom. And so maybe he's thinking, hey, I'll fight for freedom for America, but also I'll get my freedom. Either way, he signs up. Well, Lafayette asks him to go and work as a spy. So James Armistead goes into the British camp pretending to be a spy. Well, it just so happens that if you remember the famous American general turned American traitor, Benedict Arnold was the famous American traitor who became the British general who had actually conquered Richmond, which is the reason James Armistead wanted to get involved in the first place. When James Armistead was sent by Lafayette to go serve in a British camp, it happened to be the camp of Benedict Arnold. So when James is serving in camp, he does such a good job serving that the officers saw him serving and said, you know, a guy like that should probably serve the officers because he's too good to serve the common man. So James begins serving in the officer's tent and learning the officer's plans. Actually, he gets reassigned and begins serving under Cornwallis, who is the commander of all the British forces. James is the guy who learned that Lord Cornwallis was going to be moving a large section of troops and going to Yorktown. Actually, James Armistead gets Lafayette the information. Lafayette writes a letter to Washington where he says, I have a spy in the camp who's just given me information that Lord Cornwallis is going and moving his troops, and this might be the time we've been waiting for to capture him and conquer him and maybe end the war. Well, this is exactly what happened. The Americans were able to surround Yorktown, and this is where this is a painting depicting the surrender of Cornwallis. James Armistead is a guy largely credited with the intelligence that led to the capturing of Cornwallis, who's the commander of all the British forces, and this major victory arguably led to an end of the American Revolution. Now, why does this matter? Because James Armistead is credited with the intelligence that led to this victory. So this victory, the last major battle that's considered to have won the Revolution, would not have happened had it not been for a black patriot who was a spy in the Revolution. And not only that, if you look at the military intelligence that we have today, it goes back to people like James Armistead. Now, why this matters is if you think big picture American Revolution, when we think of how did the Revolution begin, we might look at the shot heard around the world. But John Adams says the Revolution actually began in 1770, the Boston Massacre, because that's when the British shed the first American blood, and that's when the war actually began. Well, if you remember the Boston Massacre, there was a man killed in the Boston Massacre who's considered the first blood shed in the Revolution. Well, that man was Crispus Attucks. And there were many famous depictions and paintings done of Crispus Attucks, of the black man being killed by the British. If you look at the Revolution, The revolution arguably began with the death of a black patriot, and the revolution was won arguably because of the intelligence of a black patriot. What this means is you can't even fully tell the story of the American Revolution without including the contributions of black heroes and black patriots in American history. And I've only given a few examples. We have entire history books of just black heroes from the American Revolution, from the War of 1812, from the Civil War, throughout American history. And yet today, very few Americans know anything of these black heroes. Why don't we know these black heroes today? Well, you can back up to a guy like Woodrow Wilson, who's, I would argue, the biggest culprit of why we don't know so many of these black heroes. When Woodrow Wilson was a professor at Princeton University, he wrote a new history series, and actually it was considered kind of this chronological history of America from the beginning all the way up to that point. It was a 5-volume set, and it was believed to be the most scholarly history book ever done. Well, in this, he became so prominent and well known because of this that he became the president of Princeton University. And then, not long after, he became the president of the United States of America. Well, Woodrow Wilson was also a very racist man, so much so that when he became the president of the United States, one of the things that happened under his watch and leadership was the rebirth of the KKK. Not only that, Woodrow Wilson showed the very first ever film in the White House, which was The Birth of a Nation. It was a recruiting film for the KKK, and some of his administration actually marched in the marches for the KKK, even in Washington, D.C. So Woodrow Wilson, very racist guy, very bad guy. And actually, this is depicted even in his history books, because if you back up to his history books, he removed every single black person from American history, not just the heroes, every black person in general. And in his history books, he not only ignores every black hero, but by the way, how do you talk about the Civil War and leave out Frederick Douglass or the Mass 54th? And there's so many examples we could give. He leaves them all out. And yet in his history book, he wants to make sure that if you don't know about black people, he wants to show you what black people look like. And if you look at this, if you've ever seen the scales of evolution where it goes from goo to you, one of the things that it shows is kind of like these Neanderthal images. Well, why in the world would Woodrow Wilson have incredibly racist images in his book? If you back up to some of the leading scholars and scientists of the day, you have people like Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, in his early book, it was, right, we know it as The Origin of Species, but actually there's a subtitle to it, and it's The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Charles Darwin actually argues in his writings that the lighter your skin, the more evolved you are, and the darker you are, the less evolved you are, or the more Neanderthal you are. And this was largely accepted in academic circles, which, remember, Woodrow Wilson was a professor. He was the president of a university. This was academically and scientifically accepted, which, by the way, some of those notions today when people say, well, trust all the science. I don't trust all the science because I know not all scientists are right, but this is exactly what happened in American history. And because of this, because of these kinds of notions, what happened is most Americans today, because of guys like Woodrow Wilson that removed all these heroes, most Americans have never heard of these heroes today. And yet it's very easy when you look at original historic documents to identify that had it not been for the contributions of many of these black patriots, America would look and would be very different. And yet today, we don't learn about so many of these heroes and the contributions, or even how black and white people work together to do great things, to advance equality and civilization, and how America was leading the way in this. What we hear is, no, America was really, really bad, right? 1619 Project is what's promoting that idea so much today. And because of that, there's articles that are coming out every single month about how America was rooted in slavery and all of America is about slavery, and this is what we hear so much of. So let me just finish by giving a few thoughts related to slavery. First of all, it's worth noting that America was not ever a leader in the global slave trade. That's a big deal because today we hear that America was one of the biggest leaders and perpetuators of the slave trade. That's just not historically accurate. And if you back up and look at this, the North Atlantic or the African slave trade lasted from roughly 1501 to 1875. And during that time period, approximately 12.7 million slaves were taken out of Africa. Scholars have gone back and researched to identify where those 12.7 million slaves arrived when they went off continent. And what they discovered is that if you look at those 12.7 million slaves, 43% went to Portugal and Brazil and their holdings, 24% went to Great Britain, 15% went to Spain, 11% went to France, 5% went to the Dutch, 2.5% went to the United States, and 1% went to Denmark. What does that mean? America absolutely did participate in something that was very, very evil. But America was nowhere close to a leader in this, which is what is argued today. And it's also worth noting at this point in world history, every single nation in the world had slavery because it was a global condition. One of the arguments today is that America is evil because we had slavery in our past. I would point out, every nation in the history of the world had slavery. In fact, every single people group at some point was enslaved and at some point enslaved other people, because this is the history of humanity. It goes back to the notion we started with, is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Nobody's perfect, so everybody has done bad things at some point. Every nation has done bad things at some point. That's part of the history of slavery. Even with that being said, America has still done remarkable good when it comes to the story of slavery, so much so that America was the very first nation in the history of the world to sign a law banning the slave trade. Thomas Jefferson signed that law on March 2nd, 1807. England signed a law very similar 3 weeks later on March 25th, 1807, but America was the very first nation to sign a law banning the slave trade. America was the fourth nation in the history of the world to actually ban slavery. We did it in 1865. Now, we were the fourth nation. England did it before us in 1833, and then Denmark, and then France, and then America. At that time in world history, there were 128 nations in the world, and America was the fourth nation to actually end slavery. And I would argue America paid a higher price in ending slavery, because slavery in America ended at the end of the Civil War, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts we've ever seen in American history, with more than 600,000 Americans that died in that conflict. And at the end of that conflict, we ended slavery in America. And I'll go even further, because if you look today, slavery still exists today. This is the map depicting the nations of the world, and the different colors are showing nations who are doing better or worse jobs with slavery. Now, to give you context, there's 193 member nations of the UN, and that number actually changes every year. It was 191, then 195, and 193, and it changes based on who's gone to war with who, or who's conquered who, who's captured who. But just recently, of those 193 member nations, 94 of those nations had not passed laws banning slavery in their nation. In many nations of the world, slavery to this day is still legal. And that's why it's estimated there's more than 40 million people in slavery in the world today. That's more than at any time in world history. And this is even in Africa today. There's more than 9.2 million people legally enslaved in Africa. There's people legally enslaved in China and India and Indonesia. This is actually not unusual for much of the world. And yet, with that being said, one of the things that the Global Slavery Index does is not only it shows the nations that are doing a really poor job with slavery, it shows the nations that do the best job. And right over here, it shows the nations taking the most action to end slavery in the world. And the nation doing the most is the Netherlands. The nation in second place is the United States of America. America is doing more than virtually every other nation in the world to oppose slavery. And here's the key takeaway. If you look at America, one of the things you can know about America is America started legal opposition to slavery before any other nation in the world, March 2nd, 1807. And that's America as a whole. That's not even including the states up in New England, because every single state in the North, back in the pre-Civil War days, actually at the end of the American Revolution, every single northern state had begun passing laws to outlaw and eradicate slavery in their states. So even before, as a nation, we took steps to outlaw slavery, we had northern states that were doing things to end slavery. And so this is where, before anybody else in the world, America's doing things legally to oppose slavery. America also paid a higher price in ending slavery than any other nation in the world because of the Civil War. And America does more than virtually any other nation today to oppose slavery. When you look at America, it's true that America definitely has the sin of slavery as part of our past, but it's also true that America has one of the most exceptional anti-slavery records of any nation in the history of the world. And that's something that doesn't get reported today. And on top of the fact, it's also worth noting that America largely could not have become America without the contributions of black patriots. And this is what today has been so lost. We don't know these stories anymore. And yet at Wall Builders, we try to do a lot to retell many of these stories, to reintroduce people to some of these heroes they've never heard of before. And I will point out that there are dozens, if not hundreds of other examples we could point to. It's just today we don't know the history. And so when people look at America today and think America's so bad, it's because we don't know the history of America. Or even though America's not perfect, how well America did at overcoming the sins in her past. And I would point out, if you look at any atrocity in American history, if you simply ask the question, how did it end in America? What you will always find is the reason those atrocities ended in America is because Christians stood up and said, we can't do that anymore. We have to stop those things in America. And that's why America corrected and stopped those evils and those sins faster than virtually any other nation in the history of the world. And that's why America largely should still be celebrated today.
Okay, wait, Tim. I got to jump in here on you, man. There were so many times you were dropping truth bombs. I mean, things that people have never heard before.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard before. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, you just changed the whole narrative on America's bad and evil and we're the worst. In other words, you basically reset the table and said, okay, everybody was bad.
Yes.
But America was leading the charge.
Correct.
Instead of being drug along, which is what we've been told for the last year.
We know so little of history, both world history and American history, that we think America was the only people group that struggled with sin or did anything bad or evil. Well, that's just silly.
It's everybody.
Every single nation in the history of the world has done bad things. And when we look specifically at what America did, America consistently was at the forefront of leading the charge to correct those problems and evils. And it's not to say that America didn't do bad things. Absolutely. America's done many bad things in our past, but America also, because of the influence of Christianity, because of so many pastors and churches and leaders who have stood up and said, we have to stop this, so many patriots. America has corrected those problems faster than almost any other nation in the history of the world. And that's why, if we're going to tell the honest story, tell the story that America did some very bad things, but tell the whole story that America fixed and changed those things faster and sooner before virtually anybody else. And that doesn't mean that America doesn't still have problems today.
Right.
We recognize a lot of problems that we want to solve today, which is why we're doing what we're doing.
But isn't the reason that America was leading the charge on that is the very thing we're talking about in this course, because of biblical citizens, because people in America were saying, like you were saying, pastors were saying, this has to change. And even all the way back to the Declaration, that the principles that have been laid in place from the beginning are what made us want to provide that freedom for everyone.
What you will see consistently throughout history is the people who have done the most to correct the problems in America were people who knew the Bible, who were patriots, who followed the constitutional principles, those Declaration values, and when they applied those things and they fought for those things, they helped change those problems in the nation. And that's really where we are today. We need more of those patriots, biblical-minded, constitutional thinking, Declaration value promoting citizens standing up and saying, we need to solve these problems. And when we get involved, we're really the only hope. Like it's kind of silly that we think something's going to change without our involvement, because it's always been the biblical-minded people standing up for those right principles and values, fighting to change where there needed to be equality, where there needed to be equal rights, where there needed to be major steps forward. This is where, again, today, we need those biblical-minded constitutional citizens to stand up and saying, we're going to make a difference.
Okay, so short answer to the question, is America worth saving? Absolutely yes.
Absolutely.
This value system is worth preserving, and if it's going to be preserved, it's up to the folks that are watching this to be biblical citizens and continue this spread of freedom.
You've said it. You got to be biblical citizens.
Today is really special. We're going to actually open up the vault of history.
We have over 100,000 documents from George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin.
The library was like going back in time.
All kinds of incredible documents and weapons, great treasures from the Revolutionary War.
It's so cool when you actually see it and you're actually feeling it. And for the Green family, it's better than going to Six Flags or SeaWorld.
Can you smell the smoke in it? That's smoke from American Revolution.
I'm in awe of this kind of stuff.
We're able to go back and see what they actually wrote, what they said, so we know what they believe.
When I read the actual documents totally contradicted what I'd been taught by teachers about those documents.
We live in an age where we need a revival of patriotism in our younger generation.
A bunch of kids don't even know about this stuff. And I realized that that's what we do. You know, we learn about this, we study, and then we go teach it and hopefully get to inspire other people.
Jesus said, you know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Most of the time, people just don't know the truth very well.
Well, that's it for week 2 of Biblical Citizenship in Modern America. What a wonderful opportunity we had tonight to go into the Wall Builders Museum and Library and learn about the spheres of government and learn about the fact that America is worth saving. Now, next week, we're going to be right back in this classroom learning about truth and courage, and then we're even going to head out to the very room where the Constitution and the Declaration were created, the Cradle of Liberty, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You don't want to miss week 3 of Biblical Citizenship in Modern America.
Wow, what a history lesson, huh? I know it's fast and furious and a lot of facts, but very interesting.
Did we learn anything new about slavery? I mean, I found that to be pretty educational. Yes, yes. So we have a couple questions here because we'd like to give a couple giveaways. And Janet will start.
And for those who were not here last week, I gave a little tidbit of in your workbook. The answers are in the back. And if you go through next week's answers and write them in when we ask these questions, because it is open book. It is open book. So we just try to help you guys retain a little bit more and learn it. So first question. What are the excuse me, let me back up. Name the 3 institutions of government found in Scripture. Who's raising?
Anybody? Okay.
By show of hands. Janet. Family, government, and church.
That's
Very
correct.
Good. You win the.
Thank you. What are the 7 mountains of cultural engagement? Remember they had that illustration of the 7 mountains with the different organizations? Very good, Nancy. That's awesome.
That's on page.
That's okay.
That's on page 12, I believe.
Yeah.
You win the Truth of History DVD.
That's great. This one here.
Okay, what was the most often quoted source used by our forefathers? By show of hands. Bible? Very good.
You should all get a present on that one.
I know, but I don't. This is 100 Bible verses that made America. So it pays to do your homework. Anyways, that was found on page 13 of your workbook. And
should do it.
I received this in the mail from PragerU. I'm just going to pass it around if anybody wants to look at it, but I want to leave it with Angela, since she's a school board member. It talks about the 250-year celebration coming up of our country. It gives you all kinds of educational resources and online videos. They're all free. So just check it out. And did anybody have an aha moment or something that they wanted to share from tonight's class? Yes.
So yeah, apparently, and he started all that stuff before he even became president. So you can imagine the power that he had while he was in the presidency.
And that's why we didn't learn all this, because it was already removed. And so we're going to reborn it, if that's a word.
And I'm just amazed over the black heroes that we have involved in the course of our nation. Yeah. And
Where's that museum at?
Pastor, do you?
Texas.
At Aden, Texas.
Yeah.
Wall builders?
Wall builders. It's in Texas.
Yeah, Aden, Texas.
Aden?
Fort Worth and Dallas, right in that area.
Right.
It's in the heart of that area.
Yes.
He is, and, but it's already been implemented into the schools from the previous administration, and this is everything we're trying to get out. And
In Shoal schools? No, it was, but it's not.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. That'll be, that's it for this evening. I'm going to close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening, Lord. Thank you for this opportunity to come together. And Lord, we just give you all the worship. And we pray this in your mighty name. Amen.